Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're talking about a geopolitical time bomb, a conflict that's simmering in the Middle East. And if it goes off, well, it could send shockwaves through the entire global economy, all by choking off one of its most critical arteries.
So let's just jump right in and ask the big question about one of the most important and honestly, one of the most vulnerable spots on the entire planet, the Strait of Hormuz. What on earth would happen if someone just turned off the tap? All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the rising tensions, basically a looming war. Then, we'll get into Iran's ultimate trump card. After that, we'll see why this tiny strait is a massive choke point for the world's oil, what kind of economic shockwave its closure would cause, and finally, the absolute nightmare scenario.
Okay, so first up, a looming Gulf War. You've got rising tensions between the US, Israel, and Iran, and that's really setting the stage for a major conflict. Let's dig into what's happening on the ground.
So right now, we're seeing a pretty significant U.S. military buildup in the area. We're talking aircraft carriers, fighter jets, missile batteries, the whole 9 yards. This is not just a show of force. It's a very real preparation for potential large-scale attack, probably alongside Israel. And you know, the stated goal here is incredibly ambitious. Nothing less than a full-on regime change in Tehran.
And Iran's response? Well, they are not backing down. They're making it crystal clear they're ready for a fight. The chief of their armed forces literally said, "Our fingers are on the trigger." That's a direct, unambiguous warning.
And that brings us to Iran's ultimate deterrent. If they're backed into a corner, facing a threat to their very survival, they have what a lot of people call a suicide option, and that is the power to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Now here's the thing you have to understand. Iran knows for a fact that it can't go toe-to-toe with the US Navy in a conventional fight. They wouldn't even try. So instead, they'd use something called asymmetric warfare. It's the classic strategy of a smaller force using unconventional tactics, think mines, fast boats, missiles, to fight a much bigger, more advanced opponent.
So what does that look like in practice? Well, their strategy is all about layers. They can harass ships with anti-ship cruise missiles. They can use submarines to launch torpedoes. They can send out swarms of fast attack craft, some with crews, some as drones. But the fastest, the cheapest, and frankly, the most terrifying tool they have: naval mines.
And they have a lot of them. The best estimates put Iran's arsenal at around 6,000 naval mines. Think about that. If they drop even a fraction of those into the narrow, shallow shipping lanes of the strait, that waterway becomes completely impassable. And we're not talking for a few days or a couple of weeks, we're talking for months. Okay, so this brings us to the big picture, the world's oil choke point. Why should you, me, or anyone else on the planet care about this one tiny 33-kilometer-wide strait? Well, the sheer volume is just mind-boggling. Every single day. 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products pass through the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a trickle. It's a massive river of energy that literally keeps the lights on and factories running all across the globe. And if you look at the global numbers, it's a huge piece of the pie. We're talking about a quarter of all seaborne oil and petroleum, more than a third of all crude oil shipped by sea, and a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas. I'm not exaggerating when I say this is the single most important energy highway on Earth.
And for some of the world's biggest energy producers, it's their only way out. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, they are almost totally dependent on this strait. If it closes, their exports are basically trapped. So who's on the receiving end of all that oil? Well, the biggest customers are in Asia. We're talking about economic giants like China, India, Japan, and South Korea. They get about 80% of this oil. So if there's a shutdown, they feel the pain first, and they feel it hard.
All right, so let's connect the dots here. We've got the world's most important energy choke point suddenly shut down. What happens next? Well, this is where we get the global economic shockwave, and the fallout would be immediate and, frankly, devastating.
The very first thing you'd see is a massive price shock on the energy markets. I mean, oil prices would go through the roof. Analysts at big banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are projecting that the price of crude could pretty much double overnight, jumping from around $70 a barrel to $130, maybe even more. And that, of course, translates directly to what you pay at the pump. So, for example, in the US, where gas prices might be hovering somewhere under $3 a gallon, you could expect them to soar way past $5.
That's immediate pain for consumers and for pretty much every business that relies on transportation.
But, and this is a huge but, this is exactly why this is considered a suicide option for Iran, because by closing the strait, they would be completely strangling their own economy. Almost 90% of their oil exports, 85% of their total trade, relies on that exact same waterway. So this isn't a first resort, it's an act of pure desperation, something they'd only do if they felt their very survival was on the line.
Okay, as bad as everything we've talked about sounds, believe it or not, it could get much, much worse. Closing one choke point is a crisis, but what comes next could be a true nightmare scenario.
See, in a full-blown war, you're not just looking at a blockade. First, the Strait of Hormuz gets mined. Then, you'd likely see direct attacks from both sides on critical energy infrastructure. We're talking refineries, pipelines, loading terminals all across the Gulf. And then, to make a terrible situation even worse, Iran's allies, the Houthis in Yemen, could move to shut down another key waterway at the same time, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
And let me be clear, the simultaneous closure of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb would be a global catastrophe. Period. One choke point is a crisis. Two is a total blockade. It would effectively sever the two main arteries for Middle Eastern energy exports to the rest of the world. The economic fallout from that, it's almost impossible to imagine.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really critical question to think about. In a world that's so deeply connected by these fragile choke points, is any major regional conflict truly regional anymore?